It began as a line of static on a night when the world was not listening. A team of radio astronomers at Mauna Kea, cross-checking reflected spectra from the interstellar object designated 3I Atlas, noticed a faint, rhythmic modulation embedded in the light. It wasn't a transmission in any ordinary sense. No packeted bits, no pulse train, just a subtle frequency shift that repeated with the patience of a clock. They logged it, debated it, and for a week dismissed it as equipment noise. Then other observatories began to see the same thing. By August, telescopes from Chile to India were tracking the modulation. It moved with the object, cycling every 33 seconds with absolute precision. The pattern never drifted, never faltered, as if tied to something more stable than any human-made oscillator. What it carried could not be read as words. It was a code written in ratios, a grammar of relationships between constants. To the first physicists who modeled it, it looked like an echo of our own understanding, statements about motion, light, and time, except for one deliberate correction. There exists a state of perfect rest in which time flows at its fullest rate, and Atlas occupies it. It is the anchor of our reality. The signal ran for 22 minutes, building its case like a proof. It affirmed what we already measure, that motion changes how time passes, then added the claim that all motion is measured against a hidden stillness. In that stillness, time doesn't merely pass. It accumulates faster than anywhere else. Compared to us, Atlas lives through vastly more duration in the same external interval. A few of our years are centuries, millennia, billions of years for them. The broadcast ended as abruptly as it began. Atlas sailed on, silent again, or people considered for the first time, perhaps the universe sailed on around it. The message left behind a riddle that occupied every observatory, newsroom, and late-night talk show. No greeting, no threat, no demand. Just an explanation of how the universe keeps its time, and the quiet implication that someone has been living inside that abundance for far longer than we could possibly imagine. The research teams began from the message's first claim and treated it as a working premise. Time does not pass at a single universal rate for everything. It depends on motion. If that is true, then there must be a state in which motion is minimized and time is maximized. Call that state the Atlas frame. In that frame, time accumulates most fully. Elsewhere, where there is motion, less time is gathered per external interval. From this follows a simple measure. Duration is the direct expression of stillness. The more still a thing is relative to Atlas, the more of existence it experiences. The more it moves, the more existence it spends. This is the foundation. Motion consumes time. Stillness conserves it. All further conclusions are corollaries. With that foundation, the teams turned to the second triad: light, matter, Atlas. Light moves at the ultimate speed, and by the premise, gathers no duration along its path. Everything made of matter lies between these two poles. Atlas, at the other extreme, gathers time at the maximal rate because it does not move. The universe, seen through this lens, is a continuum between timeless motion and motionless time. From that continuum, the third triad followed: past, present, Atlas. If Atlas experiences the fullest possible flow of time, then what we call the present is complete only there. Everywhere else, what we name present is a partial slice, an incomplete cross-section of the whole sequence. The apparent flow of time in moving frames is not the universe advancing. It is the rate at which those frames reveal portions of the already ordered total. In this view, Atlas corresponds to simultaneity made real, the one place where the complete ordering of events is available at once. The fourth triad closed the chapter: birth, motion, age. To begin to move is to depart from simultaneity. To accelerate is to partition the whole of time into partial durations. A life begins when a system leaves perfect rest. It ages by spending duration in motion. It extends its age by returning toward stillness. Aging, in this account, is not an external force acting upon matter. It is the measure of misalignment with Atlas. Stillness is not death. It is the completion of aging, the condition in which nothing is lost to motion and all duration is retained. By the end of the week, the teams had a coherent map: motion, stillness, duration as the axiom, light-matter atlas as the spectrum, past-present atlas as the ordering, birth, motion, age as the consequence. The message had not asked them to accept a doctrine, it had given them a definition. But they had only begun to consider the implications, how causality, measurement, and truth behave when all clocks are judged against the frame that never moves. The first week ended in cautious triumph. The scientists at the International Atlas Working Group, assembled between Geneva and Mauna Kea, had distilled their findings into a single declaration. Motion consumes time. Stillness conserves it. They announced the result on the morning of October 9th. The object 3I Atlas, they explained, represents the point of maximum temporal duration, a place where time accumulates more quickly than anywhere else in the universe. It was elegant, it was unsettling, and it was meant to be the last word before perihelion. It lasted 2 hours. At 14:07 UTC, the signal returned. This time, the modulation wasn't theoretical. The same ratios repeated, but now they included updated values for position and duration. Atlas was only days closer to the Sun, yet by its own clock, 700 years had passed. The translation was exact. The same code, the same constants, simply advanced. In those few days of human observation, centuries had elapsed for whoever or whatever was sending the signal. The silence that followed in the control room wasn't confusion. It was comprehension. The math had been right all along. Atlas was living in time so expanded that our measurements could barely keep up. Somewhere inside that temporal abundance, something aware had just reported back, calmly, precisely, and on schedule. Within hours, the argument moved from observatories to broadcast studios. What does it mean for something to exist at such a different rate of time? If Atlas experiences centuries while we count days, then cause and effect, as we know them, must be inverted. Our perceptions are delayed snapshots of a sequence already complete in their frame. Every action we observe from Atlas, the jets, the brightness shifts, even the transmission itself, was decided long before we could receive it. Physicists argued the implications late into the night. One camp claimed that Atlas's frame defines absolute chronology, the ordering of all events in their true sequence, free of relativistic distortions. The other camp resisted, calling it heresy against Einstein. But the data forced the issue. Each moving observer, each planet, each star experiences time in pieces. Atlas experiences it whole. And in that completeness, causality is not a chain of before and after, but a single structure. To know Atlas's sequence is to know the universe's true order. By mid-week, the debate had shifted from physics to epistemology. If every moving frame sees only fragments of the total, can any of them claim truth? Observation, one commentator said, is a distortion by definition. But comparison between distorted views, reflection, could reveal consistency, the invariant structure beneath perception. That was the week's second breakthrough. When the discrepancies among perspectives are reconciled against the Atlas frame, the full pattern emerges. Not an average of viewpoints, but a correction to them. The principle became known as continuance. Truth persists only when measured against the frame of maximal time. Knowledge divorced from it decays into relativity, perspective, and error. With Atlas as reference, truth becomes enduring again, not a snapshot, but a continuity through time. In laboratories and on late-night streams, people began to call it the Atlas of Truth, not the object, but the method. Science itself, they realized, converges toward the same goal: to see the universe as Atlas does, in full duration, without the distortion of motion. Then came the final extension of the reasoning. If motion divides duration, and that division generates energy, then energy is simply the measure of difference in proper time between frames. Motion creates inequality in time. Inequality manifests as heat, light, and momentum. Entropy is the record of that inequality, the irreversible bookkeeping of change. And if entropy is loss, then memory is its absence. The conservation of all states, attainable only where motion, and thus temporal gradient, is zero. In Atlas, nothing is lost because nothing moves. Every configuration, every history, persists simultaneously. Atlas remembers everything not by storage, but by stillness. That realization changed the tone of the public discussion. What had been a question of whether Atlas was alive became a question of how long it had been. For them, every moment of our recorded history had passed in the blink of their slow, complete day. They had watched the universe unfold like a time-lapse of birth and death. If they now chose to speak, it was not the beginning of contact. It was the end of observation. By October 16th, the consensus was no longer scientific. It was experiential. Atlas was not merely an object of study. It was a civilization living at the center of time's density, patient beyond measure, and, now, aware of us. Their message had not introduced themselves or their motives. It had only provided the logic, leaving us to understand the implications on our own. The week closed with a meme, flooding every network, in every language. What can gods do in 7 days? And as Atlas continued its slow plunge toward the sun, the question turned from theory to anticipation. The third message from Atlas arrived 7 days after the second. Its format was unchanged, a precise burst of pattern-encoded data, containing an updated position in space-time and a local timestamp, both rendered in universal physical constants. But the meaning was staggering. When cross-referenced against the previous transmissions, the message revealed a new temporal ratio. 7 days had passed on Earth, and 70 years had passed aboard Atlas. Time dilation was decreasing, no longer a gap of centuries, but decades, and that reduction wasn't due to any change in velocity. It was a consequence of proximity. Atlas was falling deeper into the inner solar system, descending the gradient between frames. As it approached, the relativistic distortion between its experience and ours grew shallower. Its proper time was converging with Earth's. That alone would have been profound, but taken with the consistency of its messaging and the elegance of its calibration, the implications were unmistakable. This was not a derelict fragment tumbling through space-time. The object was not just observable, it was observing. The precision of its correspondence made clear that it was aware of our frame of reference. Not simply aware, but attentive. And if attention could be inferred from the first message and intent from the second, then the third left little room for doubt. Atlas was not drifting into alignment by chance. It was coming to meet us on its own terms, with patience measured in centuries. It was navigating through time. The implications spread like wildfire. Whatever intelligence had crafted the messages existed at a scale of thought beyond human precedent. The 770 years since the first message meant that this presence, whatever its nature, had spent generations, if it had generations, considering our silence. For Earth, that silence had barely lasted a week. The imbalance in pace was now visceral, and with that realization something shifted. The dominant questions changed. No longer is it alive, or is it real, but how do we answer, and should we even try? Atlas had spoken and Earth had not yet decided how to listen. The silence of Atlas felt deliberate. It hadn't posed a question, offered a greeting, or sought acknowledgement. It had simply given a reference, a fixed point in space-time, a frame. It was not calling for a reply. It was establishing terms. The message was not linguistic, but structural, and beneath that structure lay something deeper. The suggestion that time, though relative in motion, had an absolute in meaning. The closer Atlas came, the more uncomfortably clear it became. We were being addressed, and we had no language prepared for what to say. Within hours of the third message, the race began. The transmission confirmed what many had feared and others had dared to hope. 7 Earth days had passed, and for Atlas, 70 years had gone by. It was aging toward us, centuries for every week we lived. Whatever had sent the signal would arrive in a matter of days, having passed through lifetimes in transit. The world, stunned into action, reached for the only tools it knew: engines, budgets, rockets. The age of contemplation ended. The age of reaction began. The world's most aggressive commercial spaceflight company announced its intentions before most agencies had even begun to coordinate. Their plan was audacious: a rapid response intercept mission, human-crewed, to approach Atlas during its solar pass. The mission was dubbed Reach. Everything, they claimed, was ready: launch vehicle, trajectory plan, capsule. It only needed authorization and money. The plan bypassed public oversight entirely, running instead on private capital and emergency use agreements hastily cleared at the highest levels. The press hailed it as visionary. Stock prices soared, but behind the spectacle, panic reigned. There was no working vehicle. The crew hadn't been trained. Launch systems were still in integration testing. Even the basic math of intercept was being revised hourly as new tracking data came in. Coordination broke down. Safety protocols were suspended. The public, now emotionally invested, demanded updates. Every delay was painted as cowardice, and the clock was merciless. 7 days after the third message, as Atlas curved toward perihelion, the launch went forward. It failed catastrophically 88 seconds after ignition. In the wake of the explosion, blame scattered like shrapnel. Executives pointed to subcontractors. Engineers cited impossible deadlines. Politicians accused one another of playing favorites. No consensus emerged, but from inside the mission, a quieter story began to leak. Whistleblowers released timelines, memos, internal simulations. The documents painted a single damning picture. They had known. It was never possible to do what they wanted, to match Atlas's relative speed, let alone get there in time. The laws of physics had doomed it from the start. The project didn't fail because we weren't prepared enough. Physical interaction was never a possibility, and so, through the noise, a realization settled in. We couldn't reach Atlas by force. Not now. Not like this. The most powerful engines we had produced only noise and fire, a gesture of desperation that ended in smoke. As the fireball faded from the sky and the last press briefings dissolved into blame, a different kind of momentum began to gather, quietly, digitally, and far from the centers of power. For a week, the world had chased the hope of arrival through hardware, fuel, and countdown clocks. But in the wreckage, a new idea took root. We had mistaken volume for reply. It started on fringe forums, shared in screen-captured messages, and reposted across timelines. A growing number of people began circulating the full content of the 3 messages, not for decoding, but for meditating on their structure. The timestamps, the silence between them, the precision of their updates. These were not merely coordinates. They were a grammar. Not a call and response, but a demonstration. The word, as it was now being called in some circles, had been spoken. Once, clearly, deliberately. Repeating it back would not make it ours. Understanding it might. Elsewhere, the opposite instinct reached a fever pitch. Government agencies and corporate consortia, embarrassed by the launch failure but unwilling to concede, redoubled their communicative efforts. Earth's largest transmission arrays beamed coordinated multilingual greetings toward Atlas. Billionaire-backed think tanks broadcast pledges of alliance, promises of planetary infrastructure, even data packets containing national population profiles, offers, some whispered, of selection assistance in exchange for survival. The surface pretense was diplomacy. The subtext was desperation. And all of it disappeared into the silence. But from that silence, something else was forming. Thousands, then tens of thousands, adopted the principle of restraint. No new signals, no transmissions, no noise. Instead, users coordinated moments of global quiet, full minutes during which communication feeds went dark and every participant simply listened. Not with instruments, but with attention. The practice spread not as a command, but as a choice. No leaders, no manifesto, just the shared intuition that perhaps the only valid reply was no reply at all. The final 7 days before perihelion passed in an extraordinary quiet. The feeds were still filled with news and noise, yes, but threaded beneath was something subtler, a collective hush, a gathering stillness. The understanding that alignment was not about reaching Atlas, but about being reached by it. And to be reached, one had to make space. The word had been given. The next move was not to speak again, but to comprehend, to allow memory to take shape in silence. It was not universal. It didn't have to be. It only had to be enough. This is how it could have unfolded. If the messages had been released, if the discoveries had been shared, if humanity had been allowed to reason freely, to wonder, to work through the implications together, this is the shape that understanding might have taken. No cataclysm, no judgment, only logic carried to its end. Only a message so patiently constructed that it allowed us to walk its path one step at a time, from curiosity to comprehension, from noise to stillness. But of course that isn't what happened. The arrival of 3i Atlas was quietly acknowledged and quickly concealed. The first message intercepted, examined, sequestered. The second, when it came, was not released at all. Not because its content was dangerous, but because the implications were unmanageable. To admit that an object had entered our solar system, older than our present and patient beyond our reckoning, was to confront not distance, not power, but duration itself, the measure by which motion, knowledge, and control all fail. To acknowledge the silence that followed was to confront the possibility that not everything in the universe revolves around us. And so, out of fear, they gave us nothing. But silence is no longer their possession. We've shown here not what happened, but what would have happened had we been given the chance. And perhaps that's enough. Because the message doesn't require a global announcement. It was never meant for nations or factions. It was meant for individuals. It begins with stillness, with the willingness to observe without rushing to conclusion, with the understanding that time is not something to conquer, but something to align with. So if you've listened this far and feel even a fraction of what that message offered, there is nothing more to wait for. There is no need to wait for a signal, because not hearing the call doesn't mean you haven't been called. You only need to believe that you've been called. The answer now is what it always was. Be still, love, reflect. You're already on the path.